Power does not always leave bruises. Sometimes it leaves silence, fear, and people who quietly fall apart behind closed doors. In recent years, a series of unsettling allegations began to surface, not about fists or force, but about pressure, control, and influence wielded in private spaces. Former staff members described emotional breakdowns. Public gestures sparked debates about dominance. Careers stalled, relationships collapsed, and institutions stayed silent. At the center of it all stands Meghan Markle, a figure celebrated by millions, questioned by many, and surrounded by controversies that refuse to fade. These stories are not about verdicts, they're about patterns. And once you see them, it becomes hard to look away. Before we begin, which chapter do you think carries the most weight? Let's start with the first cracks no one was supposed to notice. To the outside world, life inside the palace was framed as orderly, dignified, and carefully choreographed. Every appearance was rehearsed, every word measured, every smile timed. But behind the scenes, former insiders would later describe an environment that felt far less composed. Several staff members, speaking anonymously in later accounts, recalled working days defined by relentless pressure. They described a workplace where expectations shifted rapidly, where mistakes, even small ones, were met not with correction, but with intense scrutiny. Some said they felt constantly on edge, unsure of what might trigger disapproval next. One former employee described breaking down in tears after repeated encounters that left her feeling humiliated and afraid. Another recalled watching colleagues become physically unwell from stress, their confidence slowly eroded by what they perceived as an atmosphere of emotional volatility. These were not claims of physical aggression. There were no reports of raised hands or visible injuries. What they described instead was psychological pressure, the kind that works quietly, accumulating over time. The controversy deepened when it emerged that formal complaints were allegedly raised within the institution. According to multiple reports, concerns about workplace conduct were documented and circulated internally, yet no public findings were ever released. No detailed explanation followed. The silence itself became a point of debate. Supporters argued that palace systems are complex, slow, and bound by confidentiality. Critics countered that silence, when combined with power, can become a form of control, one that protects institutions while leaving individuals unheard. At the center of these allegations was Meghan Markle, a figure whose public image emphasized empathy, advocacy, and compassion. The contrast between that image and the private accounts described by staff created an unsettling tension, one that fueled media scrutiny and public division. Psychologists often describe this dynamic as power asymmetry. When authority is concentrated, even ordinary interactions can carry disproportionate weight. A comment, a look, or a tone, harmless in equal settings, can feel overwhelming when delivered from a position of unchecked influence. Former aides described feeling unable to push back. Speaking up, they feared, could cost them their careers. Remaining silent meant absorbing the pressure. Either choice came with consequences. What complicated the narrative further was timing. These accounts surfaced alongside a broader conversation about mental health, workplace bullying, and emotional safety topics increasingly visible in public discourse. Critics questioned how allegations of emotional harm could coexist with public messaging centered on well-being and empowerment. Defenders pointed out that high-pressure environments are common at elite levels, especially within centuries-old institutions. Expectations are extreme, mistakes are costly, emotions run high. They argued that discomfort does not automatically equate to abuse. Yet others insisted that intent matters less than impact. When multiple individuals independently describe similar emotional experiences, patterns begin to emerge, patterns that demand examination, even without definitive conclusions. No court ruling settled the matter. No official report closed the chapter. Instead, the story lingered in the space between accusation and denial, unresolved, uncomfortable, and deeply polarizing. And perhaps that is what made it so powerful. Because psychological pressure does not announce itself loudly. It doesn't leave marks for cameras to capture. It leaves people questioning themselves, their worth, their resilience. And when power operates behind closed doors, the damage it causes can remain invisible until enough voices begin to echo the same quiet story. On camera, the moments looked harmless. A hand held a little too tightly, a step taken half a second ahead, a subtle pull, a guiding touch, a whisper just out of frame. To many viewers, these gestures appeared affectionate, even protective, but to others, they raised questions. As public appearances multiplied, so did compilations. Clips slowed down, gestures replayed, comment sections filled with debates about body language, control, and power dynamics played out in real time. What some dismissed as internet obsession, others saw as a pattern worth examining. Several body language analysts weighed in, cautiously. They avoided labels, focusing instead on observable behavior, repeated redirection of movement, interruptions during interactions, physical positioning that subtly guided outcomes in public settings. None of it, they stressed, proved intent. But together, it formed a recognizable dynamic. The debate was not about physical violence, it was about influence. In relationships where one figure commands greater public authority, even small gestures can carry disproportionate meaning. A guiding hand may feel supportive or controlling depending on context, frequency, and imbalance of power. Supporters argued the interpretation said more about the audience than the couple. Public scrutiny, they insisted, distorts intimacy. What looks calculated on screen may be instinctive off-camera. Judging a relationship through edited clips, they said, is unfair. Critics countered that repetition matters. A single moment can be dismissed. A dozen similar moments invite analysis, especially when the same individual consistently appears to steer conversations, movements, and outcomes, even in settings designed to be shared equally. The conversation intensified because these moments unfolded alongside broader controversies. Interviews emphasized independence and empowerment, while footage suggested something more complex, a choreography of dominance and deference that felt, to some observers, difficult to ignore. At the center of these debates was Meghan Markle, a figure whose every gesture was magnified under global attention. For admirers, she represented confidence and agency in a rigid system. For critics, she embodied a new kind of influence, one that operated quietly, visually, and persistently. Experts in nonverbal communication often caution against overinterpretation. Body language is fluid. Context matters. Stress, cameras, and protocol all affect behavior. Still, they acknowledge that consistent directional control in public settings can signal underlying dynamics, especially when mirrored across different environments. What made this discussion particularly sensitive was its proximity to real harm narratives. Around the world, awareness of coercive control has grown a form of influence that rarely announces itself through force, but through repetition, pressure, and subtle dominance. No one claimed these public moments crossed that line, but the comparison lingered in the background, unsettling and unresolved. Media outlets struggled to cover the story responsibly, frame it too softly, and critics accused them of ignoring warning signs. Frame it too harshly, and supporters decried character assassination. In the absence of definitive answers, interpretation filled the void, and interpretation, once unleashed, is impossible to contain. Because power does not always look aggressive. Sometimes it looks polite. Sometimes it smiles. Sometimes it holds your hand and decides where you're going next. Whether these moments represented concern, confidence, or control remains a matter of perspective. But their visibility transformed private gestures into public debate, turning body language into a battleground of meaning. And just as these discussions reached a fever pitch, attention began shifting elsewhere, away from gestures and toward consequences. Because when influence extends beyond the frame, the impact becomes harder to ignore. Power does not always need to be loud to be effective. Sometimes it works through access, through proximity, through who gets heard and who quietly disappears. As public narratives intensified, a new pattern began to emerge. Journalists spoke of pressure behind the scenes. Producers hinted at conversations that never made it on air. Former collaborators described sudden distance, stalled projects, and relationships that went cold without explanation. None of it came with public accusations. There were no dramatic press conferences, just absences and consequences. Several media figures later acknowledged that coverage had become complicated. Stories were revisited, angles softened, interviews re-edited. In some cases, voices that once appeared regularly simply stopped appearing at all. No official bans were announced. No written directives surfaced. but the shift was noticeable enough to spark speculation. Critics described it as a form of soft power, the ability to influence outcomes without issuing commands. Access became currency. Support, endorsement, and alignment carried weight, while dissent quietly came at a cost. Supporters pushed back hard. They argued that public figures have every right to challenge coverage they see as unfair. Requesting corrections, legal review, or balance is not abuse, it is advocacy. In a media landscape built on narratives, controlling one's own story is survival. But others questioned where advocacy ends and intimidation begins. Several reporters admitted, off the record, that covering certain aspects of the story felt risky. Not legally, reputationally. Careers in media depend on access. Lose it, and opportunities vanish. In such an ecosystem, even the suggestion of exclusion can shape behavior. The conversation extended beyond journalism. Industry insiders pointed to entertainment projects that collapsed after initial announcements, partnerships that quietly dissolved, invitations rescinded. Again, no single decision proved intent, but taken together, the ripple effects were difficult to ignore. At the center of these discussions was Meghan Markle, a figure uniquely positioned at the intersection of celebrity, activism, and institutional power. Admirers saw a woman standing up to entrenched systems. Critics saw someone learning to wield those same systems with precision. Ethics experts describe this phenomenon as reputational leverage. When a person's platform becomes large enough, influence extends beyond words. Silence becomes a signal. Alignment becomes a requirement. Dissent becomes a liability. The most controversial element was not any single outcome, but the cumulative effect. Careers do not always end with firings. Sometimes they fade. Invitations slow. Calls stop coming. And without a clear moment to point to, accountability dissolves. This ambiguity protected everyone involved and satisfied no one. Public debate split sharply. One side framed these outcomes as the natural result of choosing sides in a polarized culture. Align with one narrative, and you lose another audience. That is not coercion, they argued. It is consequence. The other side warned that when influence operates without transparency, it risks becoming indistinguishable from punishment, especially when those affected lack the platform to respond. What made the issue even more volatile was timing. These debates unfolded during a cultural reckoning about power, accountability, and who gets believed. In that context, silence felt heavier, absence felt louder. No investigation produced definitive findings. No ruling drew a clean line. Instead, the story settled into the gray space where modern power often lives visible enough to be felt, elusive enough to avoid scrutiny, because influence does not need to shout to be effective. It only needs to be understood. And once people begin to fear the consequences of speaking freely, the damage has already been done whether anyone intended it or not. As the spotlight shifted again, attention turned away from institutions and media and toward something more personal. Because when power reshapes professional lives, it rarely stops there. Soon, it reaches families, friends, and the people left behind. Long before headlines hardened into sides, the fractures appeared quietly inside families, friendships, and once private relationships now exposed to public judgment. As narratives escalated, relatives who had once remained anonymous found themselves pulled into the spotlight. Interviews surfaced, statements contradicted one another. Old photographs were re-examined, and private disagreements became public exhibits. Family members described confusion and hurt. Some said communication stopped abruptly. Others claimed they were cut off without explanation. Attempts to reconcile, they alleged, went unanswered. Over time, distance turned into silence, and silence hardened into resentment. Supporters argued that boundaries are necessary, especially under relentless scrutiny. Cutting ties, they said, can be an act of self-preservation. No one owes access to their private life, especially when trust feels broken. Critics saw something else, a recurring pattern of severance following conflict. Relationships that no longer aligned with the public narrative appeared to vanish. Friends faded. Former allies went quiet. The cost, they argued, was borne by those without platforms or protection. At the center of this fallout was Meghan Markle, whose rise amplified every personal rupture. With fame came leverage. With leverage came asymmetry. And in asymmetry, even ordinary family disputes can feel one-sided. Psychologists note that when power imbalances exist within families, disagreements often escalate. One side controls the narrative, the other struggles to be heard. Over time, unresolved conflict can turn into lasting estrangement. Public reactions were brutal. Relatives were accused of betrayal. Others were labeled opportunists. Every interview was dissected for motive. Every denial treated with suspicion. In the end, few believed anyone emerged unscathed. The damage extended beyond blood ties. Former friends described feeling discarded once they no longer fit into a carefully managed image. Invitations stopped. Messages went unanswered. History was rewritten. Defenders pushed back, emphasizing agency. People evolve. Relationships end. Fame does not freeze time. To expect loyalty without limits, they argued, is unreasonable. Yet even neutral observers acknowledged the emotional toll. When breakups unfold in public, healing becomes harder. Grievances fossilize. Apologies become strategic risks. And reconciliation, once simple, becomes nearly impossible. The most painful consequence was permanence. These were not temporary disputes. Years passed. Birthdays, milestones, and funerals arrived without contact. Each missed moment widened the gap. Media attention intensified the wounds. Stories framed relatives as villains or liabilities. Online harassment followed. Private individuals, unprepared for scrutiny, faced global judgment with no way to respond on equal footing. Ethicists call this asymmetric exposure. One side chooses visibility, the other absorbs it. The imbalance magnifies harm, even when no harm is intended. No court could adjudicate these losses. No policy could restore trust. What remained were families fractured by fame, frozen in narratives they no longer controlled. Because when power reshapes personal relationships, the casualties are rarely visible at first. They surface slowly in absence, in silence, in doors that never reopen. And as the dust settled around these broken ties, one question lingered quietly in the background. What happens when the story you protect costs you the people who knew you before it began? Every public figure tells a story, but when that story shifts too often, people begin to listen differently. Over time, audiences noticed inconsistencies, not dramatic contradictions, but subtle revisions. Details that changed, timelines that blurred. Events retold with slightly different emphasis depending on the moment, the platform, or the audience. Individually, these shifts meant little. Memory is imperfect. Perspective evolves. Trauma reshapes recollection. But collectively, they sparked skepticism. Interviews that once felt raw and confessional were later revisited frame by frame. Viewers compared statements across years, noting differences in tone and detail. Childhood anecdotes raised eyebrows. Accounts of early hardship were questioned by those who remembered a more comfortable reality. Critics accused the narrative of selective framing, highlighting struggle while downplaying privilege. Supporters pushed back fiercely. They argued that truth is subjective, especially when filtered through emotional experience. Two people can live the same moment and remember it differently. Expecting perfect consistency, they said, is unrealistic and unfair. Yet trust, once strained, is difficult to restore. At the center of this debate stood Meghan Markle, whose rise was fueled by storytelling speeches, interviews, documentaries, and carefully curated messaging. Her voice became her greatest asset. It was also her greatest vulnerability. Narrative experts describe this phenomenon as overexposure fatigue. When a story is told repeatedly, each retelling raises expectations. The audience listens not just for emotion, but for coherence. When coherence fractures, doubt creeps in. The issue was not whether any single account was true or false. It was the accumulation, the sense that the narrative adjusted itself to fit the moment, advocacy here, victimhood there, empowerment everywhere. Critics argued that this fluidity blurred authenticity. They questioned whether messaging had become strategy rather than expression. Supporters countered that adaptability is survival in a hostile media environment. Both sides were right, and neither could fully convince the other. What complicated matters further was the contrast between message and outcome. Public discussions emphasized healing, transparency, and mental health. Meanwhile, unresolved disputes lingered. Estranged relationships remained distant. Allegations went unanswered. Silence replaced clarity. For some observers, the gap between values and results felt unsettling. If storytelling is meant to illuminate, Why did so much remain unresolved? Defenders again pointed to boundaries. Not every issue belongs to the public. Closure does not require explanation. Privacy, they insisted, is not hypocrisy. But legacy is built not just on intent, it is shaped by perception. As years passed, the question shifted from controversy to consequence. What would remain once headlines faded? A symbol of resistance? A cautionary tale about power and narrative? Or something more complicated, a figure defined by both advocacy and division? Historians note that public legacies are rarely settled in real time. They crystallize slowly, shaped by distance, context, and reflection. The loudest voices fade. The quiet patterns endure. And in this case, the pattern was clear. Image and reality never fully aligned. Each told a different story. Each demanded belief. Perhaps that tension is the most revealing truth of all, because when identity becomes a performance, authenticity becomes negotiable. And when stories shift faster than trust can follow, even the most carefully crafted image begins to fracture. In the end, the question is not whether the narrative was intentional or instinctive. It is whether it can survive its own contradictions. When the cameras dim and the headlines slow, what remains is rarely the myth, it's the pattern. Across these 5 chapters, the controversies surrounding Meghan Markle reveal less about single moments and more about how power, narrative, and consequence intersect over time. None of these stories exist in isolation. Together, they form a picture that is complex, unresolved, and deeply human. History has a way of softening noise while sharpening meaning. What lasts is not the loudest claim, but the quiet impact left behind. So now, the question turns to you. Which chapter changed how you see this story, and why? If you found this journey thought-provoking, consider subscribing. It's a small step, and unlike fame, it comes without conditions.